Lying in Islam. Are Muslims allowed to lie? Here I am on Islam questions and answers. Cases in which lying is permitted. Let's scroll down here. It is not lawful to lie except in three cases. Something the man tells his wife to please her. Like, honey, do I look fat? Oh, no, you don't, honey. To lie during war, and to lie in order to bring peace between the people. A liar is not one who tries to bring reconciliation amongst people and speaks good in order to avert dispute, or he conveys good. Lying is the source of all kinds of evil and mischief, a major sin. However, there are some instances in which Islam permits lying. If that serves a greater purpose, you see that? If that serves a greater purpose or wards off greater harm. Even in these instances, it is advisable not to lie. Now let's see. I'm going to show you a story. Let's see if this is all true. This lying permissible under these conditions. To what? To do good, to avert dispute or conveys good, or greater purpose towards of a greater harm. Let's go to the story and see all of these was applicable.
Do you see the damage to the engines? The pilots flying this plane made a series of insane mistakes and they slammed into the runway, bouncing a few times before taking off again. The passengers rode in terror for the next 5 minutes as the engines failed and the aircraft plummeted to the ground, killing 97 people on board. This is the captain and the first officer that were flying the plane. The captain was 58 years old and had been flying for the airlines for 24 years and had over 17,000 hours of total flight time, with almost 4,800 hours on the Airbus A320. The first officer was 33 years old and had acquired almost 2,300 hours of total flight time, with over 1,500 hours on the A320. Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 was supposed to be a routine flight into the airport in Karachi, Pakistan. The weather was mostly clear skies with just a few scattered clouds on a bright sunny day. The captain and the first officer made friendly conversation for most of the flight, but as they got ready to descend, that's when things started to go wrong. They were initially assigned the arrival procedure depicted here and highlighted in yellow, but then air traffic control subsequently cleared them direct to Mockley, which looks more like this arrival procedure. Now, because this is a shortcut, it means the pilots will have less time to descend. Now, the investigation revealed the reason they didn't do the approach briefing is because they were too distracted talking about stuff that wasn't relevant to the flight. I think another reason why they didn't do the approach briefing is because the captain has probably flown this arrival perhaps hundreds of times based on how many flight hours he has, and that means he's probably very complacent and overconfident. Now that's a very dangerous combination that's going to lead to some really insane mistakes, as you're about to find out. When air traffic control cleared them direct to Mockley, they were also cleared to descend to 10,000 feet. One of the pilots reached up and changed the altitude and pushed the altitude select knob to command a managed descent. This meant the aircraft would begin a descent to fly a pre-calculated path down to 10,000 feet, honoring any altitude restrictions along the way. Even though the aircraft is starting the descent and heading in the right direction, the pilots failed to cross-check and verbalize that the aircraft is doing what they're telling it to do. The reason this is a problem is because you always need to have a clear understanding of what the aircraft is actually doing versus what you're telling it to do. About 3 minutes later, the pilots were cleared to descend to 5,000 feet. The pilots made the change and the aircraft captured the correct descent profile and the auto thrust reduced to idle to allow for the descent. Unfortunately, once again, the pilots didn't verify this and instead they kept talking about things that weren't relevant to the flight. At some point during the descent, they changed the radio frequency without being directed, and for about 2 minutes they weren't talking to anyone. They were so distracted by the conversation with each other that the approach controller had to call them on guard, which is the emergency frequency, and eventually got them back on the right radio. As the aircraft passed through 15,000 feet, they were cleared to descend further down to 3,000 feet and cleared for the ILS to runway 25 left. Still, no verification or discussion of what the aircraft is doing, and this is when things are going to start to spiral out of control. And that's because when the pilots got that clearance, they changed the altitude on the control panel to 3,000 feet, but they didn't update the flight management system. The shocking truth is that if the pilots weren't distracted right now and instead they were verifying what the aircraft was doing, they could have updated the FMS to reflect 3,000 feet at Mach, and simulator test proved that the aircraft would have adjusted the descent profile and they would have made the descent without any problems and everything would have been fine. Instead, the pilot mistakes are about to get a whole lot worse. The aircraft was at 9,300 feet when they reached Mach, and this is still okay because remember, the FMS has that holding pattern built in at the next waypoint for them to continue their descent. And that's why the controller asked the pilots, confirm track mile comfortable for descent, and one of the pilots said affirm. The controller is essentially trying to figure out if they're going to continue to descend in the holding pattern or just continue with the approach. And at this point, the chaos in the cockpit begins. The captain knows they're high, but instead of just going into the hold and telling the controller, the captain goes into complete panic mode. He yells at the first officer, "What has happened? Stop, stop. Oh no, take out the hold, take out the hold." The first officer complied and asked if they should report the issue, but the captain told him no, just tell approach were established on the localizer. The other thing is usually the pilot monitoring does all the talking on the radio. But in this case, you've got the captain making the first officer fly the aircraft, talk on the radios, and make all the changes to the FMS. At this point, they're at 9,200 feet, and if they were flying the approach correctly without the holding pattern, they should have been down at 4,700 feet, so they're about twice as high as they should have been. While all of this is going on, the Karachi Tower can see the aircraft on radar, and they called Karachi approach and told them the aircraft was too high, and approach responded saying, "Yes, it's too high, I am observing and will give orbit." The controller asked the pilot what altitude they were passing, and the crew lied by rounding down a few hundred feet. The controller asked the pilot what altitude they were passing, and the crew lied by rounding down a few hundred feet. And the crew lied by rounding down a few hundred feet. And the crew lied. Now they're over Sabin at 7,800 feet when they should have been down at 3,000 feet. And this is when one of the pilots just needs to say, "Go around." That way they can level off and they can tell approach that they're executing a missed approach. That would have been the safest and most logical thing to do, and it's just shocking to me how the first officer is just going along with whatever the captain is doing. Now, I understand it's probably a cultural thing for him to not speak up against what the captain is doing, but at some point, you have to value your own life and the safety of everyone on the plane more than your concern that you might offend the captain. But at some point, you have to value your own life and the safety of everyone on the plane more than your concern that you might offend the captain.
Again, however, there are some instances in which Islam permits lying if that serves a greater purpose or wards off a greater harm. Now, when this pilot lied, did that ward off a greater harm or put that situation into more harm?
Basically, that's a polite way of telling the pilot you're 4,500 feet high and only 10 miles from the runway. What do you want to do? And the captain's answer was simply, "No problem, sir." A few seconds later, the target airspeed was changed to 248 knots and the landing gear was lowered. Neither one of the pilots called for the gear to be lowered, and whoever lowered the gear didn't say anything about doing it. Now, with the landing gear and the speed brakes extended, their rate of descent increased to 7,500 feet per minute, which is insane considering how close they are to the ground. The controller again tried to warn them, saying, "Sir, orbit is available if you want." And the captain directed the first officer to tell them it's okay, and he hesitated but eventually said, "Negative. We are comfortable, we can make it, inshallah," which basically means God willing. And he hesitated but eventually said, "Negative. We are comfortable, we can make it, inshallah," which basically means God willing. Inshallah, which basically means God willing.
Now take a wild guess. Which religion is that? Which religion says inshallah? What does inshallah means? If Allah wills it. Take a wild guess. Which religion says that?
So, in my mind, the first officer knows that they're not going to make it, but he doesn't say or do anything about it. About 30 seconds later, the captain said to the first officer, "He will be surprised what we have done." And to me, this just demonstrates how insanely dangerous the captain is because of his overconfidence and complacency. The controller tried to warn them again a fourth time when they were about 7 miles from the runway, telling the pilots, "Disregard, turn left heading 180. Technically, the terminology should have been something like cancel approach clearance, fly heading 180, maintain 3,000 feet. Honestly, it doesn't really matter though because the pilots ignored the controller and a few seconds later they said, "We are comfortable now out of 3,500 for 3,000 established." Once again, lying about their altitude. Once again, lying about their altitude. Remember that it's a clear sunny day, so the pilot should be able to look outside and easily see the runway and be able to visually assess how dangerous this is. As far as the aircraft is concerned and the indications that you get in the cockpit, it looks like the real thing, but it's going to result in a much steeper descent angle to the runway. And this is why you should always be at the correct assigned altitudes on the approach and intercept the glide slope from below. Thankfully, the controllers caught the mistake and told the pilots negative, turn left heading 180. But again, even though they were still significantly above the correct flight path, the pilots continued to ignore the controller and responded, "We are established on ILS 25 left." Pay attention to what happens next, because at this point the aircraft is still following that false glide slope, and the pitch is getting steeper, and as their pitch exceeded 13 degrees nose down, their descent rate was 6,800 feet per minute, and the autopilot disengaged and they got a master warning. The pilots didn't acknowledge the warning or talk about the autopilot disengaging or the need to hand fly the aircraft. Things continue to get worse as they start getting sink rate cautions and pull-up warnings, and even though a pull-up warning requires an immediate terrain avoidance maneuver and it's a memory item, instead of doing the procedure, one of the pilots raised the gear and retracted the speed brakes without saying anything, and then they were cleared to land. If you think the landing is going to be bad, just wait until the end when I share with you what else the investigation discovered. As they continued the approach just 3 miles from the runway, one of the pilots extended the flaps to flaps 3, triggering more overspeed warnings. Finally, at 1,100 feet and 227 knots, the first officer asked if they should do the orbit, and the captain said, "No, no, leave it." The investigation determined that the first officer was probably the one that had raised the gear and retracted the speed brakes because he wanted to do the orbit, but he never really voiced any concern to the captain or told the captain that he had raised the gear. At this point, the captain took over on the controls, and instead of saying, "I have the aircraft," he just pushes the control stick nose down and they get a dual input warning. And that means both pilots are trying to fly the plane at the same time. Not surprisingly, the pilots don't say anything or talk about who's the one flying the aircraft. The aircraft is smarter than the pilots, and it gives them a warning that the landing gear isn't down, and they get more overspeed warnings, but the pilots ignore all of them. At 500 feet above the ground, they're still doing 220 knots and descending at 2,000 feet per minute. While they're still in the air just a few feet above the runway, they selected full reverse thrust on both engines, but nothing happened because they're still airborne. They ended up landing gear up, and as the engines made contact with the runway, the captain had full nose down input on his control stick, while the first officer was pulling his control stick almost full nose up. They got an engine fire warning on the number 2 engine as they bounced and skidded down the runway, and eventually the first officer yelled out, "Take off, sir, take off." Now, the better choice would have been to stay on the ground, and that's probably what the captain was trying to do, but for some reason he decided to finally listen to the first officer, and he advanced the thrust levers to the takeoff and go around power setting, and they got airborne. They struggled to keep the aircraft flying as they tried to comprehend what just happened. There was no discussion, though, between the pilots about the gear up landing or what they should do next. The captain planned to circle around to attempt another landing on runway 25 left, but because of the engine damage, the number 1 engine did an uncommanded in-flight shutdown, and when it did that, the pilots had actually already pulled the number 2 engine thrust to idle because of the fire warning. Now that number 2 engine stayed at idle for about 1 minute until the pilots realized it and they re-advanced that thrust lever. Unfortunately, due to the damage to the engine was only operating at about 65%. And as they began a base turn towards the runway, they had multiple stall warnings, and the aircraft begins losing altitude. And then one of the pilots lowered the landing gear and they crashed into a residential neighborhood. There were 91 passengers and 8 crew members on the aircraft. Somehow, 2 passengers managed to survive the crash. The investigation discovered that the captain had flown 289 flights in the last 12 months prior to the crash. They analyzed those flights and found several unstabilized approaches with numerous high speed, high rate of descent, and jip whiz warnings on his flights without any go arounds. 1 month after the crash, the investigation revealed that 34% of Pakistan International Airline pilots had fake or suspicious pilot licenses, with pilots often paying others to take exams for them. The craziest part about this entire story is that despite all of the insane and dangerous mistakes, the investigation determined that if the pilots had just left the landing gear down, it was possible that they could have stopped on the runway and everyone probably would have lived.
Sadly, people had to die in this situation. Now, was lying brought reconciliation amongst people and speaks good in order to avert dispute, or he conveys good? Was lying a source of all kind of evil, mischief, and major sin? However, there are some instances which Islam permits lying. If that serves a greater purpose or wards off a greater harm. This incident, did it ward off a greater harm by lying? Why didn't the pilot save the plane? Why did he have to lie? What was the purpose? Was it a war? It's not a fighter airplane. They were not in a war. Their incident of lying and properly flying the airplane killed people. Inshallah. Was that, inshallah, was that God's will or Allah wills it? This is a sad religion that costs people's lives. That's why I teach against Islam. I love the people, but the religion itself, it hurts people and it kills people. That's why I advise, come to Jesus. My goal is to save Muslims to come out of Islam and come to Christianity. Who is lying from? Where does the source of lies come from? John 8:44. You are of your father, the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer, you just killed. That plane just killed people. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. So if Islam allows people to lie, where does the source come from? Who is their father? John 8:44 says the devil. The devil is the one who is a liar, he's a murderer from the beginning. And he's the father of lies. So if Islam is allowed to lie, who permitted it? Who is the source behind it? Who are their father? The father of lies, the devil. Right here, you are of your father, the devil, for he is a liar and the father of it. Is that inshallah or insha shaitan? Who is it are you serving? Come to Christianity. Come to Jesus. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by Jesus Christ. I'm lying as well. Come out of Islam. I come to the real Messiah, His name is Jesus, the Son of the living God. Amen.